Well, thank you very much. My name is Robin Harding, Tokyo Bureau Chief of the Financial Times, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session, which is optimistically titled Japan Transforming. When you live in Japan, it can often seem like nothing is transforming, and many of the issues we're going to talk about today, consumption tax hikes, debt, demographic challenges, will seem very familiar. But the thing I've come to realize is that Japan does transform. It just does it very quietly and slowly. So you don't see it happen, but then you wake up one day and find that you're living in a completely different country. I can start first with what I think is the big economic question on the minds of everyone in Japan right now, which is whether consumption tax is going to go up again this year from 8% to 10%, scheduled for October. Let me start with you, Nathan. Should the consumption tax go up this year?
Well, thank you, Robin. It's a pleasure to be here. It seems to me that there are two key questions here. The first is there enough momentum in the economy to be able to absorb the tax increase? And then the second one is, given where the economy is, does such a move make sense? On the advisability, I think that the Japanese economy is performing at a solid clip. Growth in the first quarter surprised on the upside. It looks like growth will continue in the second quarter. The BOJ remains stimulative. This is poised, certainly independent of a tax increase. This is poised to be a year of positive growth for Japan. Now, a related point is how much drag will this consumption tax increase generate? And I think clearly it's designed to be less of a headwind on the economy than the previous consumption tax increase. It's only a 2 percentage point increase. Certain aspects like food, certain kinds of expenditures have been carved out. And I think very importantly, the government is preparing a meaningful fiscal stimulus package to accompany the consumption tax increase that would offset it. And my sense is if the administration is a little bit more worried about where the economy is, that package may be a little bit bigger. So looked at on the macro, it feels to me like they're committed to it. It feels to me like the economy is not doing great, but it's doing all right. And I think that there is a reasonable case for it. From the macro. And that's kind of where my sense is that it's still a close call, but maybe 60-40 that it moves forward. The deeper question is how worried should Japan be about its debt? Is this a justified move in a deep way? And I think the reality here is clearly Japan has high debt levels. By any metric. But similarly, there is very much a sense that the wolf is not at the door. Funding for the Japanese government, suffice it to say, is not a problem. Interest rates don't bear any risk premium, at least discernible risk premium, associated with these debt levels. On the other hand, I think there is an argument that we don't know how conditions will change in the future. And it makes sense from that perspective to move in a slightly defensive way to the debt levels relative to GDP have broadly stabilized in recent years, to put that on a gradually declining trajectory. And I think the consumption tax will do that.
I'm hearing that as a yes.
I'd say a qualified yes.
Okay.
Qualified as yes as economists get.
Stephen, we'll get to debt in a moment, but what's your view just on the consumption tax?
Well, Robin, on our sovereign rating, we rate Japan at A stable. And we often get asked a good question, why isn't Japan a AAA rating? When you visit Japan, it looks and feels like an advanced and wealthy economy, which it is. It's got all sorts of intrinsic financial strengths, net external creditor, large current account and persistent current account surpluses, stock of domestic savings, which the government has done a very good job at tapping and financing its debt. And yet at 230% of GDP, that public debt ratio is the highest of any sovereign that we at Fitch Ratings rate. We rate about 118 countries globally. You cannot find a country with a higher debt burden. As Nathan said, that leaves the economy one day vulnerable to shifts in market sentiment. Eventually, it's hard to imagine today, but if and when interest rates rise, imagine financing that debt burden. So we do see the plans to move forward on the 2% consumption tax hike as credit positive. Any rollback we would have to look at from a ratings perspective. I'd also, just while I have the floor, like to comment on a couple of other areas. Abenomics, in our view, has been a success so far. In boosting nominal GDP growth, in generating a very tight labor market conditions, 2.5% unemployment. We're seeing over time nominal wage growth picking up. So the debt burden, the good news is no longer rising. Nominal GDP growth from 2012 to 2018 grew by 12%. That's in contrast to minus 6% in the previous 6 years. You said you live in Japan, it's hard to see progress. Well, that's some progress, at least moving in the right direction. The last point that weighs on the rating is potential growth. We estimate potential growth in Japan over the medium term at around 0.7%. That places it really toward the bottom of advanced economies. Only Italy, to my knowledge, has a lower potential growth estimate. This is where the reforms that we're going to discuss really come in. And here there has been progress in the labor market and demographics.
Let's save that for later.
Yep.
Kathy and Charles, very quickly, as people who are based in Japan, moving from should the consumption tax rise go ahead, do you think it actually will go ahead?
So our base case is that it is likely to go ahead. But as was just discussed in the prior panel, there are a lot of headwinds, particularly and namely due to trade friction. And we were assuming at Goldman just a few weeks ago that, for example, the G20, if there was a potential discussion between the heads of China and the United States, that would result in just postponing kind of anything harsh. But now we see, the tariff on Mexico, and our base case is a 10% tariff on the remaining $300 billion of imports from China, which could go higher. There's also a pending decision about auto tariffs, which would particularly hit Japanese autos very hard. Our auto analysts just put out a piece that if those tariffs do go to 25% on autos, Japanese autos, the sector operating profits could be hit by 32%. So a lot of moving pieces here. If it doesn't go down that path, then we're assuming that it will go ahead.
And just one thing to clarify, when do you think they have to make a decision by?
It is probably going to be decided sometime by the end of this month or the beginning of July. And there's another complicating factor, which is the upper house elections, which are due to be held in July. But there's a lot of chatter, if you're here in Japan, to the effect that perhaps the Prime Minister, Abe, may want to call a lower house election at the same time, i.e. hold double elections, really to bolster his support for what we think his longer-term aim is, which is to revise the Japanese constitution. But that's all still, very fluid. Nobody really knows. But I think by early July.
I think the important point, this is a decision that has to be made very soon. Charles, what's your view?
I would just add that the Prime Minister has been asked about this question a number of times in the Diet proceedings, and his comment was that unless there is a Lehman shock-like event, that the consumption tax increase will be executed and proceeded with it. So trade potentially issues and other issues that Kathy and others talked about, always a matter that will be looked at. But yes, the expectation is that it is going to move forward. And the election, though, if it's not going to move forward, there needs to be maybe potentially a snap election. So.
Of course, he said the same thing in 2016, that he was going to go ahead if there wasn't a Lehman-style shock. And then I remember covering the G7 that year, where he desperately tried to persuade world leaders that it was a Lehman shock in 2016. So let's change the subject. Let's change the subject a little bit and come to corporate governance, which is an area where I think there really has been transformation in Japan, or at least an effort at transformation. Kathy, do you think that the corporate governance movement in Japan and the corporate governance of Japanese companies really has changed, or is it still a work in progress?
So we're of the view that the trend has definitely shifted. It isn't complete by any means, and if you think about it, corporate governance in Japan, I've been following Japanese stocks for 30 years. Corporate governance in Japan was like an oxymoron, right? What do you mean, governance in Japan? Companies are held by silent shareholders. They don't care about returns. They don't care about ROEs and things like that. But if you think about, the comments made earlier about what is one of the biggest challenges facing the economy, it is the fact that it has an enormous amount of fiscal debt, but we don't have 5% interest rates. Why? Because we have enormous piles of private savings in corporate as well as household Japan. The problem is the population is aging super rapidly, so we need to improve the returns on those savings, and particularly with respect to the corporate balance sheets, where the BOJ, of course, is keeping rates at zero. There's a particular challenge. So you kind of wonder, why did the Japanese government all of a sudden wake one day out of bed and say, let's change corporate governance standards. Let's import a stewardship code in 2014. Let's adopt a corporate governance code in 2015. By the way, Pakistan had a corporate governance code before Japan did. Just think about that for a second. So I think that the aim is very clear. We need to improve the returns on capital, and for publicly traded companies, behavior must change. So for instance, boards in Japan, the idea of having outsiders on your board was unheard of maybe 10 years ago. Now, 91% of Japanese publicly traded companies have at least 2 outside directors. That used to be 10% in the past. We now have voting disclosures, so asset managers, when they cast their votes, actually have to disclose every single vote that they cast, right? This is not even a requirement in the United States or in the UK, to my knowledge. So what I'm observing here is our corporate clients, our investing clients, are now paying much more heed to this idea that corporates are not owned by the employees or whatever other stakeholders like stable shareholders, but they have to be run more efficiently and to boost returns, which means paying much more attention to balance sheet efficiency, what are the ROEs, what are margins doing, and all of that. So this is very exciting for somebody like me who's been observing a market that really hasn't changed for a very long time, because we're observing changes that frankly are very similar to what Germany experienced in the late 90s to the early 2000s. Unwinding of cross-shareholdings, companies feeling vulnerable to activists, companies therefore caring about their share prices, caring about shareholders, caring about dividend policies, caring about buybacks in a much different way than ever before.
I guess my skepticism is, has it really changed? Yes, they have external directors, but if you probe a little, you usually find that the external director is the chairman's mate from his counterpart or something.
Absolutely. So, it's, as one client said, Kathy, who's very skeptical, he said, Kathy, this is like changing, vegetarians into carnivores. It's exactly that, right? It is so antithema to the corporate culture that has reigned over this country for so many decades, right? It doesn't happen overnight. But I think the forces of change, what I'm observing, for example, our Japanese domestic institutional clients are now really starting to press and asking uncomfortable questions to their investee companies for the first time ever. Not that they, answer those questions and deliver on those answers right away, but there's much greater scrutiny involved, I think, in those dialogues and conversations than ever before. Again, a work in progress, absolutely, but I think the ship is sailing in the right direction.
Charles, you're also a very big investor in corporate Japan. So.
Kathy has covered all the key points, and I will just add that I absolutely believe that there's been a dramatic change in Japanese corporate boards, and because the incentives and disincentives have been transformed. Kathy talked about corporate governance codes, the stewardship code, but it's also the JPX Nikkei Index 400, looking at ROEs, GPIF, the government pension fund, using indicators to look at governance, dramatic discussion endorsed by, changes endorsed by Keiran Len and other business organizations that used to be skeptical, for example, about outside independent directors' role, but now embrace it. And I particularly hear from the business conversations that I have with other executives in Japan that they are so focused on engagement with stakeholders in a way that you didn't maybe potentially have to when your cross-shareholding and boards are basically former, or if you're president, the board members are all employees that you promoted into officers and so on. That's no longer the case. So from a defensive point of view, if there's a wrongdoing, there's certainly very rigorous questioning of the board's responsibility and outside board members. From a growth strategy point of view, shareholders meeting and investors asking questions on the basis of the stewardship code, institutional investors that wouldn't be asking those kinds of questions because of relationships and so on. The change I have seen take place in this past 6 years are more dramatic, in my view, than the discussions that we've had for the past 30 years about corporate governance in Japan.
Let me just ask a really skeptical follow-up. What I sometimes hear from business executives is, we agree in governance. We agree that we're responsible business people. We know we need to run our companies well. So we understand why you want to have external directors. But what we also think is that a lot of this is about foreign investors just wanting to extract cash from our companies with no thought for the things that have made us successful over the last 50 years. Kathy, what's the response to that?
I think that's a predictable response and reaction. But keep in mind that it's not just foreign investors who are asking for this. Frankly, if you think about the pension funds, the mutual funds, this humongous Mount Fuji of savings this country possesses, and what low returns the people are getting, clearly it is those Japanese domestic institutions who are now speaking out, really, I think, more visibly for the first time. There are even some activists that are Japanese as well. So I don't think you can just say it's only foreigners asking for this. I frankly think what's really going to change this wholeheartedly, or the dimension is going to shift dramatically, is because Japanese investors ask Japanese companies, issuing companies, for change. It's not going to come from foreigners.
Yeah, let me add to this, because the Aging Society issue, the G20 agenda, is the context in which this also is being discussed. Exactly as Kathy has outlined, domestic call for change is driving this, and the government's policies that endorse that, obviously. So this week was an important week, again, in preparation for G20. Japan FSA announced a new policy document called Personal Asset Building and Management in Aging Society. It's a wonderful document, only available now in Japanese. I assume it will be available in English soon. But it's talking about how in an age where you are going to have citizens live to 100, you have to have different performance on the part of assets that Japanese citizens hold. And corporations have to change behavior in order to do that, provide that, as well as a financial service sector's role. And that means you have to achieve in a global market growth in a sustainable way. So the Corporate Governance Code does not talk about just short-term returns. It talks about sustainable growth and how to achieve, develop strategies and adopt technology in a way that companies will grow in a global market. And if the board is not calling for rational risk-taking on the part of executive management, then the board is not fulfilling its responsibility. It's not just about compliance. So all of that coming together in government policies, changing behavior on the part of companies, producing results that the citizens are demanding and the political leaders are demanding, that's a very different environment than this is a foreign direct investment challenge, short-termism. We need to counter this to protect Japan. That's not the dialogue anymore.
Okay, great. Charles, maybe since you have the floor now, maybe you'd just like to add a little bit on the changes you've seen in 6 years of Abenomics and the extent to which you think the business environment in Japan has transformed. Particularly, has Japan done anything to tackle this demographic challenge, which is all anyone has mentioned in discussions about Japan for decades now? But has anything actually changed in that direction?
So this is a major structural issue challenge that obviously is so hard to change, and you've heard the numbers. The projected decline in population from 126 million in 2017 to 88 million in 2065. Working age population changing, projected to decline from 76 million in 2017 to 45 million in 2065. That's a massive challenge. But at the same time, I think that it's been talked about over and over for the past decade or more, and it's central to the business public policy debate, and again, in a very stable government that the Prime Minister Abe's team has provided with the 6 years that we have been debating and then creating a cycle of reviewing policies and adopting additional policies to deal with it. It's not going to change the birth rate immediately, but it is leading to immigration, it is leading to changing behavior, and it is leading to debates about retirement age and other measures that ultimately will deal with the long-term challenges that Japan faces. And that's the reason I believe Japan, on its own initiative, decided to make this the agenda, central agenda, priority agenda for G20, because it is confronting issues that many mature economies are dealing, even China, in terms of aging society and low birth rate. So yes, it's not overnight changing the demographics, but it is being confronted in a way that I believe that many changes, including the consumption tax issue, as well as other sort of policy measures.
Great. Kathy, 1 minute at most on
Yep.
demographics.
No, just to add to Charles' comments, for example, on the demographic topic, we've done some research in the area of women. Japan used to have one of the lowest participation of women in its workforce in the OECD. Now it is 71%, which, by the way, is higher than that of the United States at 66% and the EU at 62%. True that most of these women are working in part-time jobs, not full-time, so we still have a dearth of female representation in leadership positions in this country, but that is a big move from roughly the mid-50 percentile about 20 years ago. So a little bit of progress there.
Okay, fantastic. I'll move on, take a question from the floor via the app here on trade, and maybe I'll ask Nathan to comment first. How will the trade negotiation between Japan and the US impact Japanese industry, specifically car makers?
So I think the trade relationship between the United States and Japan, and then quite frankly, the broader backdrop of the external environment is crucially important for the Japanese economy. My analysis suggests that in order for the Japanese economy to grow above trend, you need to have this supportive external backdrop. And I think that when we are in an environment where the United States is kind of picking and choosing who on the one hand it's going to tariff and on the other hand who it's going to look at as friends, that Prime Minister Abe has played the relationship with President Trump very effectively, and Japan has come down more on the side of friends. So I think that cutting a deal on trade is a high priority for the United States, and certainly it is for Japan. The concern I have is negotiating trade deals is a slow, onerous process. It's not something that happens typically in weeks or even a few months. It's something that takes a while. Moreover, the USTR and some of the key agencies in the United States, they have limited staffing. And right now, those folks have to be going full blast on the China trade deal and the situation with Mexico. So on the one hand, I feel it's crucially important for Japan. I think that it will happen. but I can't be overly optimistic that it's going to happen. It's going to happen quickly. In terms of where a trade deal will have the biggest impact, certainly, as the question suggests, for the auto sector. Both further opportunities in the United States, but maybe even more importantly, if it comes, it could preempt tariffs in that sector. Another sector that will be central in this debate is the agricultural sector, which will be politically very difficult for Japan. But liberalization there could also be quite transformative.
And Charles, you have some background as a trade negotiator once upon a time. What's your view on these US-Japan talks?
I had the privilege of serving in USTR from 1990 to 94, so a long time ago as a trade negotiator, but nevertheless in this sort of era where US-Japan trade friction was intense. And then fast forward to today, the context again is very different. Prime Minister Abe has led an effort after the United States decided to withdraw from TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, to negotiate with the remaining countries and completed the CPTPP or the TPP-11. So that's a high standard free trade, regional free trade agreement that the government of Japan has now entered into and implemented. Similarly, with Japan and EU, there's a free trade agreement already in place. So the negotiation has already been completed with other countries with commitments passed through the Diet, which is very different from entering into a negotiation in which you have to go through the Diet proceedings. Now, trade negotiations is never easy, and there will be challenges moving forward in U.S.-Japan trade negotiation context, but that standard has already been established, and in many ways, 30-year history of U.S. and Japan negotiators working on issues and common agreement on how to deal with it in a global context in the past decade, I think sets a great stage for professionals both sides to work on it. Now, the timing is always difficult because of politics in U.S. and Japan, but Ambassador Lighthizer has a great team that deals only with Japan inside his building in an agency, and Minister Motegi is probably one of the most experienced negotiators as well. So we have two, again, highly competent ministers working together with a very professional team that already negotiated many agreements with other countries. So then the remaining is in making sure that it's resolved in a manner consistent with principles that are open and free trade. That will benefit Japanese companies as well as American companies operating and non-American even companies operating in Japan.
So the thing I don't get about these trade talks is the trade in TPP was reduce Japanese tariffs on agriculture and in return reduce US tariffs on autos and auto parts. So here we have again the US asking for reduced Japanese tariffs on agriculture, but is President Trump really going to cut US tariffs on autos and auto parts? And if he doesn't, how does the deal get done? That's what I just don't understand about this trade negotiation. Can anyone tell me how that's going to happen?
Well, I would just interject by saying, the decision the other day by the United States government to levy a 5% tariff on imports from Mexico, which, by the way, we think is going to 10% by July, is kind of already giving a signal, I guess, to the markets that they're not interested in doing or giving anything away on autos is our view right now.
So let me just say again, U.S. has a process, and that process calls for U.S. government to notify Congress about its negotiating objectives. Regarding U.S.-Japan negotiating objectives, it's been a public comment process as well, talking to all the private sector stakeholders, and the Congress has been notified as a comprehensive negotiating objectives. And on that basis, you enter into negotiations. What comes out of that process is the deal making. So no one knows unless you're in the room, and particularly on my part, I've been away 30 years, so I really don't know.
Robin, one thing I might add here that makes this calculation so difficult and why it appears so uncertain, observing the U.S. position on trade, is that the Trump administration has more than any before, use trade for geopolitical objectives. And in that regard, this relationship that the Prime Minister here and the President of the U.S. have forged, together with the U.S. efforts to confront China, positions Japan relatively well in that. So to ask, how is this negotiation going to go, that's a great question. But against the backdrop is the geopolitics that perhaps favors Japan.
Nathan, you want to add something?
And I very much appreciate Charles's optimism that basically what can be done here is take what was negotiated under TPP and it's kind of plug and play. I guess kind of my concern about timetable, I think there will ultimately be a deal, is that was also the case with Mexico and Canada for a revised NAFTA agreement. And it still required, quite a slog. And it was extremely slow and resource intensive. And I think what we are seeing is that this president and this administration very much wants to put its stamp on these trade deals and make them feel in certain ways different than what we've seen before. So I hope it goes smoothly. And you can take what you previously negotiated and call it a deal. But I'm concerned that there are still some challenges and barriers that will need to be crossed.
Okay, so a significant risk to the Japanese outlook from trade. Please do carry on submitting your questions. Let's turn briefly to something which has almost disappeared from the conversation in Japan, even though it was all anyone would talk about a few years ago, which is monetary policy and the BOJ. It's quite remarkable how quiet it's all gone there. Why is that, Nathan? Is that just because the BOJ can't do anything, or what's happened?
Let me here speak as an apologist for the BOJ. Maybe that reflects my years working at the Federal Reserve and the genuine sympathy that I have for central banks. So on the one hand, the BOJ has not met its 2% inflation target. That is absolutely right. But I think that the stimulative monetary policy that the BOJ has put in place has nicely complemented much of the other work that's been done under Abenomics. So I think the stimulative monetary environment has supported the decline in the unemployment rate and the strengthening of the labor market that's brought in a lot of older workers and created increased opportunities for women in Japan's labor force. I think it's supported a significant increase in Japanese equity prices. Moreover, the problem that the BOJ is having is not specific to Japan. This is a global challenge that the ECB faces almost as intensely as the BOJ does, and at the Federal Reserve not quite as intensely, but qualitatively it's the same, where you have a solid economy, a tight labor market, and inflation is stubbornly low. And I think ultimately it moves to very profound questions about what determines inflation expectations. And what Governor Kuroda has been fighting against is that there is a generation of Japanese who have never really seen inflation. So if you've never seen inflation in your life, how does the central bank communicate to the public, and particularly to those people, oh, the prices are going to be rising? And I think that's the challenge that they've faced. They haven't hit 2%, but I think there have been a number of positive fruits that have come from the effort.
Stephen, what's your view? Should the BOJ be trying to do anything different at this stage?
Well, I agree with everything Nathan just said, and maybe the reason we don't talk that much about the Bank of Japan is it's been the one constant in the rapidly changing outlook for global central banks. We have long expected the Bank of Japan to stay in full easing mode for the foreseeable future. It's now providing more clarity in its guidance. It says it's not going to adjust interest rates until at least the spring of 2020. We think it'll probably be well beyond that. Could the Bank of Japan do more? Sure, there's proposals out there for expanding its asset purchase program, the assets. It could cut interest rates further, but we don't expect that in the near term. We expect more of the same. One of the critical things, that, as Nathan says, it's not the inflation puzzle and the wage puzzle isn't just specific to Japan. It's a global issue. But one thing that is clear in Japan is continued distortions in the labor market. Though there has been tremendous progress with labor participation rates among female workers, older workers, there's still a segmentation in the market between the regular and non-regular workforces, and severance pay requirements are still very high. So it strikes us that corporations are reluctant to pass on higher profits into wage growth for fear of locking that in. And when there's a downturn, a cyclical downturn, there's nothing they can do about it. They're stuck with the higher fixed costs. So perhaps further progress in the labor market could help unlock some of the inflation momentum.
So, given the topic of the panel is Japan transforming, I guess what I wanted to... We've had 6 years of Abenomics, and I think it's very well known that Abenomics was the monetary stimulus, the fiscal adjustment, and structural reforms. Does Japan now need something new? What needs to happen in Japan, both in the economic policy side and the reform side, to sort of have a new agenda for transformation over the next 6 years, and who knows how long Prime Minister Abe will stay. So I'd like to hear your ideas on what Japan should be doing next, what Japan should be doing differently. I don't know who'd like to go first and who wants a moment to formulate their views. Maybe I'll ask Kathy first, because...
I think there's a long list, obviously, but I think in my personal opinion, deregulation, there could be a lot more done, and I think that's a bit harder because it's just such an amorphous and broad arena. But if we talk about, a potential growth rate that is well below 1, and the demographics as challenged as they are, how on earth is the country going to continue to grow, to raise tax revenues, to fund the deficit, etc.? And I think a lot of areas of Japan, whether it's nursing care or leisure, tourism more recently, we have seen that if you just make a little tweak in the regulations, you could actually enjoy explosive growth. For instance, inbound tourism. Some of you don't know this, but Japan used to get only 8 million tourists annually. It is now over 30 million as of last year. Why? Did people all of a sudden discover Japan on the map? No. It was because the government realized that for certain populations, like mainland Chinese or Southeast Asian tourists, to obtain a tourist visa wasn't that easy. So they deregulated, and boom, right? We get a lot. It's harder probably for you to find a hotel room, and we've got Olympics coming up and all of that. So I think that's just one tiny example of broad deregulation that we think could unleash, especially growth in services. And then the second area I would mention, nobody raised this yet, I'm surprised, is I would call it immigration, but engaging more with the outside world, inviting more foreigners into the country, not just white collar, but also blue collar, which has begun to happen of late. But I think Japan does need more and greater diversity, not just gender, but also other ethnicities, cognitive diversity, because at the end of the day, how are you going to innovate? How are you going to create? How are you going to get more startups going in this country without more sort of injection of outside ideas? So those would be the two kind of areas.
Could you give us one example of deregulation that you think would make a difference?
I think in the healthcare arena, there's a lot of scope for if I said nursing care, I mean, to me that is such a painfully obvious area of growth, but there's so much regulation that governs that sector. So if you could deregulate, you could open the market to many more entrants, give Japanese people a lot more choices, depending on whatever income levels they have. I think that would be a tremendous growth opportunity. But again, it's mired in so many rules and regulations.
Let me jump in here and answer your question this way. I think that it is hard to do structural reform because as a matter of political economy, politicians will avoid sometimes making the hard decisions and implementing them. I think the framework that Abenomics have provided, monetary policy, fiscal, and structural reform as a package, and an ongoing review to adopt new measures to ultimately get to the goal, because there's no silver bullet, I think is key. So the framework needs to be maintained. Then it is an effective mechanism, particularly in Japan. There's a saying in Japanese, soron sansei, kakuron hantai. Agree in principle, disagree in detail. And so you need to have a framework to constantly look at specific measures, the details, the way Kathy talked about, and that's being done on an ongoing basis. So again, just this week, announcements were made. Prime Minister met yesterday to talk about growth strategy and technology changes that policies that have to be changed. And it's translating, for example, financial service firms' business model in a way that I think will help deal with the issues that we've been talking about. So I think stay the course, but then work on the details and the specific measures, whether it's in healthcare, financial services, other areas, so that ultimately you get to the goal of sustainable growth.
Stephen and Nathan, anything on the economic policy mix?
Yeah, no, I think, the premise of your question almost suggests that the strategy hasn't worked so far. So again, let me come back to some of the successes. Again, nominal GDP has risen in the last 6 years. True, the 2% inflation objective is still a dream, but it's moving toward that ever so slowly. It appears that deflation has been defeated. So I like what Charles just said about staying the course, and that's where the consumption tax comes in again. The debt ratio is no longer rising as it once was. It's flattened out. If the consumption tax hike goes forward, we project it's going to begin to decline, only 6 or 7% of GDP in the next 10 years or so, but still has the right slope to it. So stay the course, work on raising revenues and containing expenditure. And what Kathy said about reforms in the healthcare industry, that's something we hear time and time again. With the pressures, the spending pressures that come with an aging population, healthcare is a critical concern. So anything that can be done to liberalize that market and reduce spending on healthcare would help with some of the macro factors as well. And on this question, by the way, about the setback of the tariffs and TPP.
But let's not.
But just on that one, Japan has done a good job, as other Asian economies have, in forging economic partnership agreements with other regions. So you give up for some time on the US, but you pursue the EU and intra-Asia, and that's something that can be done.
Nathan.
Robin, I think your question is a wonderful one. What does Japan transforming for the next decade look like? I broadly agree with the points that Stephen was making on the macro. I don't think that macroeconomics has a whole lot more to offer than what they're doing, which is a stimulative monetary policy coupled with a slightly restrictive fiscal policy. I think that's essentially correct. I think the heavy lifting has to be done in the areas of structural reform. I think they're gaining some benefits from the CPTPP, and hopefully they'll gain further benefits from an eventual U.S. trade deal. The one additional structural reform that I would suggest kind of plays off some of the things that Kathy and Charles were talking about, and that is we've seen labor force participation rates for women rise significantly. So I think quantitatively it's there. It's higher than in the United States. The question I have is whether qualitatively women have the same opportunities in the labor force that men do in Japan. So I think that there's still scope for qualitative reform in that respect that could really unlock an additional source of powerful growth and innovation for the Japanese economy.
So we're almost out of time. I just want to make sure we put all the questions from the audience. Either all of you are passionate about coal disinvestment, or one person in the room has submitted 4 different questions on coal disinvestment. Charles, very quickly, coldest investment in Japanese financial companies.
Very important subject. We'll continue to talk about it, but not in 2 minutes, so I'll pass that on.
ESG is exploding, right?
Yes.
I know the previous panel talked about that because ESG mandates, I think this is the fastest growing market for ESG AUM in the world right now. It grew like 310% in just the last few years. So to the extent that asset owners, asset managers in this market are looking at things like that, that's going to be a question that keeps coming up in these sorts of sessions.
Robotics. Is the hope on robotics realistic and achievable as a countervailing measure to the problems of depopulation?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
And embracing it,
They're already using
unlike
it.
other parts of the world.
It's
Very
being
good.
used for healthcare and so on already, so yes.
Kathy mentioned that we need to diversify more in blue collar. How can we improve the issue with the foreign trainees system? By deregulating in blue collar work, isn't there a risk of, so the question is phrased as the risk of worsening the issue going forward, but I think it's, if you bring in a lot of immigrants to do lower skilled work, what problems does that cause for the future?
Well, like other jurisdictions, it's not going to be easy, but at the end of the day, beggars can't be choosy, right? So are Japanese people going to be construction workers or nursing care caregivers? If the answer is no, you're going to have to find somebody else, either robots or you're going to have to import them. And importantly, Japan has put a very strict rule on wages that will be paid to these foreign workers. They cannot be below their Japanese peers, so as to hopefully prevent more deflation from happening. So we shall see, and it's not happening in waves, as you know. It's 345,000 blue-collar workers in the next 5 years, but it's a start.
Robin, even after the increase in foreign workers, the share of foreign workers in the total workforce is only 2%. So there's probably still some room before those kinds of social issues become pressing.
Okay, we're basically out of time. I said at the beginning that these issues that we're raising here would probably be the same issues that we raised before. So my final question, yes, no answer. In 6 years' time, will we still be talking about consumption tax, debt, ultra-low interest rates, and the same sort of trade deal, structural reform, Abenomics questions that we've been discussing to date? So quickly, just a yes or no answer.
I say broadly yes.
Broadly yes?
Yes.
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 Okay, so Japan's transforming, but it's going to keep on transforming in the same direction. Thank you to your panelists for a very enlightening discussion, and thank you for having me here today.